I want to take a moment just as we get started here to reflect on just a little bit of the mission and my personal mission with Majority in the Middle. As such, I thought about as I was thinking about this particular series and this particular Zoom meeting I thought about what JFK wrote in 1956 in his book Profiles in Courage, in which he said, when a party or office holder differ, when a party and office holder differ as to how the national interest is served, we must place first the responsibility we owe not to our party or even to our constituents, but our individual consciences. Meaning that we as individuals know right from wrong. We should not be beholden to nothing less than our values versus a party platform. When New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia said in 1961, there is no Democratic or Republican way of cleaning the streets, that brought it home for me for what the mission of Majority in the Middle is. Politics can be divisive by nature with party affiliation, but how do we move ourselves forward effectively with civility within our system? Today, we look to understand how we as a public are informed. The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter, wrote Thomas Jefferson in 1787. So our panel today advances this noble and important aspect of information to the public and its contribution towards a more perfect union. So let me introduce our panel. First, we welcome Tom Hauser, who loves marathons. He's completed 29 of them in his career. He's one of the most recognizable faces in Minnesota political media. He's been with KSTP since 1992 and hosts the At Issue public affairs program on Sunday mornings. He's won multiple Emmys for his work and was inducted into the Silver Circle of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences for significant contributions to the television industry in 2014. Tom grew up in Edina, earned a bachelor's degree with journalism and political science from the University of St. Thomas and a master's degree in journalism and mass communication from Drake University. Welcome, Tom.
Welcome. Thank you.
Next, we have Brendan Henehan, whose formal title is Managing Director of Public Affairs at Twin Cities Public Television. The recipient of the National News Emmy amongst additional Emmy nominations and awards, Brendan has also been inducted into the Silver Circle of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. Most importantly, since 1984, he has been the producer of Almanac, which is the longest running primetime show in Minnesota and is must-see appointment television for Minnesota politicos. A native of Kalamazoo, Michigan, Brendan is also a prolific collector of aluminum Christmas trees, vintage postcards, and airline silverware. Welcome, Brendan, and thank you for joining us. And lastly, but certainly not least, Twin Cities native Tracy Perlman is an Emmy Award-winning executive producer herself and blogger at WCCO Television, where she's worked since 2009. In that role, she manages a team of reporters, photographers, digital producers to execute programs from sports to political specials. She also employs social media strategies to maximize viewer growth and engagement. Tracy has a bachelor's in journalism with an emphasis in political science from the University of Kansas. A lifelong Minnesota sports fan, Tracy is adamant about rooting for the home team. So welcome, Tracy, and thank you for joining us. As we get started, and Shannon and I have talked about this offline, but if you've never seen Aaron Sorkin's HBO show, The Newsroom, I encourage everybody on this to watch the first 5 minutes of the very first episode. It will inspire and move you. To my panelists, I want to say that is not my goal today, is to have that kind of a moment, but if you've got it in you, we'll take it. Absolutely. So Google it if you haven't. Newsroom, it's a great show. So I'll start the first one. And Tracy, let me, Tom, let me start with you a little bit here. Part of putting together political television is making sure that both sides are represented. How do you deal with that when an issue has more than one side?
Well, first of all, you've got to recognize that many issues have more than two sides. Certainly most have more than one side. There are some things I think we can all agree on, but those are very rare. So at a minimum, there's two sides, but often 3 or 4 sides. Let's just take one general possible topic would be taxes. You can have the no new taxes crowd, meaning not 1 penny more from me in any way, shape, or form. You can have others who say tax everything, including that guy behind the tree, or you've got the other side that says maybe some targeted tax increases here and there based on who is using a service that's going to be funded or what have you. Some people would call them user fees, but in general, they're taxes. So there's a number of different ways to slice that tax issue, but so often we will end up with people just talking about no new taxes or a whole boatload of taxes. And it's refreshing whenever we can get maybe at least a third voice in there saying, well, hey, maybe there's a reasonable approach we can all agree to. And the tax issue is just one of those. And I think that's something we should always strive for.
Yeah, Brendan, in your experience as a producer, how do you approach that, making sure that the issue is at least communicated in multiple fronts? As Tom said, it's not just two. Sometimes it's 6 or 8 or 10. As a producer, how do you approach that?
I work on a program that's been around since, the Earth's crust cooled. And so, one of the things, this is really basic, but important to us, is that, balance is a long-term proposition. We don't feel a responsibility each and every week to have balance when we talk about a single issue, but we got to do it long-term. I mean, if you look at something as big and complicated as, crime and public safety, it's like, it's fine one week to hear from a criminologist who's taking a long-range view, who reminds us that as bad as the crime rate is right now, it's much lower than it was 20 years ago. Or you hear from a chief of police at another time and get their perspective. Or, you hear from a community activist who's been on the ground kind of fighting against, police brutality for decades. Sometimes you can combine those things, but you don't have to week in and week out. You can, as long as you're in it in the long game, and that opens up a lot of possibilities to go deeper at any given time, when you don't say every single time we talk about public safety, we have to hear from 6 different positions.
Brendan, that was interesting. You said as part of the longest running political show. Tracy, I guess I'm interested in maybe on your view of maybe, do you feel that that's changed, that pressures that have changed there in dealing and communicating multiple sides? Do you think that that's been evolving? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, something that's important for us, or when I was doing our political show, was kind of discussing it amongst ourselves. There's more than just 2 people involved. When Tom does a story, for instance, he has a team of producers and managers and photographers, other people who are working with him to kind of round out that issue. And that's when you can kind of flush out a lot of ideas to make sure there are multiple things happening within that conversation. So even if you're not talking to one particular expert, that you are addressing those other issues. But I forgot the question you had asked initially.
Part of putting together political TV is making sure that both sides are represented. Yeah.
But I think when you have a better understanding of the whole concept of where you're going to go with it, as you're directing that conversation, you're able to ask questions and get answers so that people are able to kind of draw their own conclusions, that it's not necessarily for us, especially in a news program, when you have, a minute and a half or 2 minutes to dive into an issue and make everybody an expert. You kind of just have to present the information and let people decide what it means for them. Ad issue gets a little more time when you guys have your longer thing, and obviously Almanac has a longer format.
Yep.
And that's kind of the fun of it, to have those debates. But I know for us, there's lots of conversations that are happening to make sure, things are fair and we're presenting different types of ideas.
And
that really,
can I jump in for a second, Steve?
Huh?
I want to piggyback on something that Brendan said, and I agree with this. You don't, and sometimes it's even helpful to not have to present all of these competing sides in the same program, because sometimes so much gets lost in the debate and the people going back and forth and talking over each other. So sometimes it is good just to sit down, let's say with Congresswoman Henehan Omar, and you have her on for 6 or 7 minutes to present her side. And then you say, next week we're going to have on, Congressman Tom Emmer to get a completely different viewpoint. The problem is not all viewers watch every show. So they see a show with Henehan Omar and they think, oh, you've taken her side, you've completely sold out, you're with the Democrats. And they will not even be aware that the week before we had Tom Emmer on, or whomever it is. So that does become a problem, because people can jump on Twitter so quickly. And sometimes it happens while we're in the middle of that issue, and they're already criticizing because we only have one side on and not the other. But as Brendan said, sometimes you got to look at the long game. And over the course of time, our show, and I know Almanac is the same way, and the same thing at WCCO, ultimately, you're going to represent all sides. None of us have taken a side, whether it be the right or the left or the center. We're trying to do the best we can to represent as many potential viewpoints out there as there are. It maybe just doesn't always happen in the same broadcast.
Yeah, something I read during, oh gosh, one of the election years, during one of the political or White House runs, was people will read whatever they want, right? Like you see the headline, and if you agree with it, you take it as fact. And if you disagree with it, you think it's an opinion. And that is something that has stuck with me when we're doing political coverage, is to kind of show your work if you're doing stuff like that. Like Tom was saying, you interview Ilhan Omar one day, to make sure to mention, hey, we did interview Representative Emmer. You can go to our website to see that, or please be sure to join us. Because people will jump to those conclusions. They see what they want to see. And these days, with everything being online and there being so many different ways to get your news and information, people will seek out the information that they want to hear and not necessarily what they should be hearing, or different ideas to really round out their own argument. So I do think that that's important, that you have those touch points so that people, if they don't agree with it, they can at least dig into it and have that option too.
I think that one of my follow-up to that, I want to talk a little bit because you guys brought it up, of how you can be in the middle of a segment or in the middle of a sentence, and you're getting initial feedback. You're getting instant feedback sometimes, and you're obviously not watching the Twitter feed. Hopefully, as you're on television, you're on radio, or whatever your medium is. How do you think? And this is a little bit of an odd question. Bias in media is a topic, whether or not appropriate or not, or whether or not accurate or not. Bias is a topic of conversation. How does that change, even the potential? How does that play into your minds as producers and as hosts, and as you're putting together your coverage? Does that, making sure that you are at least, Tom, you had said journalists don't have a position, right, wrong, doesn't matter. You're presenting the facts in the best way that you possibly can, in the most accurate way. How does the perception of that, because you're going to get instant feedback, does that play a part into how you program and how you develop your program?
Yeah, I mean, good journalists don't have a side. Don't take a side. I don't take a side on television. I don't take a side at home. My wife isn't 100% certain where I stand on most things, or what party I might or might not be more aligned with, because frankly, that's not what I do. What I do is present. I mean, I'll often have people on, a Republican and a Democrat, and I'll hear good points on both sides. And I love when an interview like that happens, whereas they're not going to agree on things, the viewers are going to hear both viewpoints, and then it's up to the viewer to decide, maybe where they stand on a certain issue. And so we do get instant feedback. And the thing that is frustrating to me is that it's the old line about shooting the messenger. So many times, especially during the pandemic, and they disagreed with something Governor Walz was doing, they will literally go on Twitter and blame the media for not making Governor Walz do certain things that they want him to do. We don't have that kind of power. We can only report to you what the governor is doing. Another good case, Representative John Thompson, the governor, the majority leader in the House Speaker, the chair of the DFL party, have all called for him to resign. I've done at least 15 stories on John Thompson, and about everything from his residency to his Wisconsin driver's license to the traffic stop to, that resulted in him accusing St. Paul police of racial profiling, to the domestic abuse allegations. And I will still have people go on Twitter saying, why aren't you looking into John Thompson? Why have you not made him resign yet? Well, that's not my job. I can inform you about what is going on, And I made this point with a Twitter follower or troll, whatever you want to call him, the other day. I said, he was blaming the media that we're all on the DFL side. That's why we're treating him with kid gloves. And I said, look, you wouldn't know about what Representative John Thompson is accused to have done or the situation he would be in if it weren't for the media. And it's just amazing to me how people don't understand that. So but it's one of the things we can't control. Like Tracy said, people's perceptions at home, they're going to have them. They're going to believe what they want to believe. They're going to believe, a headline and think that you've taken a certain side. And there's not much we can do.
Yeah, I think perception is very much reality with viewers, and where they think, you're going with something, or they see you tweet a headline of something and then it's suddenly, oh, well, of course you work at CCO, you think this, or you work at, KSTP, you think that. And it can be frustrating. And there's a fine line between wanting to engage or not, depending on who it is. I'm interested for you, Brendan, with two anchors, because our political show, when we do it, was two anchors. It was Pat and Esme, and they'd be in the middle of debating something, and then they would switch sides and start counter arguing the other side. So it was kind of fun because I didn't know where they were going. So in the booth, it's a little stressful. Whereas Tom's trying to balance that all on his own as a single anchor. But do you run into that with TPT and who's going to be, good cop, bad cop, or take which position?
It's funny, as Tom was saying, and if you say, people read into things what they want to read into things, and it's hard to know what to do with that. Pew Research does some great data surveys, and their annual survey on the media is fascinating. And one of the things I think is challenging for everyone, commercial or non-commercial television, is just the increasing number of Americans who say that they seek out and they want news programming from their perspective, from their political perspective. They don't buy into the notion that you can be fair and balanced. In fact, they seek it out. And, I'm a student of history, and I try to remind myself that a century ago, every single newspaper in America was either Republican or Democratic or socialist. There's no such thing as a firewall in American newspapers in 1920. It was all, you didn't have journalists. It was all just kind of, party attitude, frankly. And you had numerous city newspapers, dailies, and you could find the one you liked. And we're kind of going back to that world. And it's, when you sit in a public media space, like, public broadcasting, where we have a mandate to be nonpartisan, that's a challenge. It really is a challenge. And how you deal with that, I wish I was smarter, because I'm not quite sure at the end of the day, where that game ends.
So let me talk a little bit more about how the actual your programs and your programming is actually created. So At Issue has Face Off. Almost every episode, every show of Almanac involves a political party or political panel. I mean, an election night newscasts, Tracy, of which you've been part of many of them, has the full gamut of political commentary. How do you each go about choosing who should be those analysts? What are their are you looking at credentials? Are you looking at affiliations? Are you looking at opposing viewpoints? How do you put together those panels? What's that process look like? I'll let anybody jump in first.
I'll jump in on that. We've been on the air now we just had our 20th anniversary in September. So still just the much younger brother or sister to Almanac, which was born in 1984. But, we tried to find people who, have credentials and credibility, people who have spent time around the Capitol or in public policy in some form in Minnesota and have a good knowledge base. So it can be a lobbyist, it can be a former state lawmaker, it can be, somebody who's run for office, and maybe they didn't win, but they were involved in the political process and are still involved in public policy in some fashion. And we generally do have somebody from the right and someone to the left. I wish we could do more, and we may look into this at some point, to have someone else maybe in the center who joins into some of those conversations. But I do like to try to find people who are at least willing to be, if they're not right in the middle, they're at least center right or center left, as opposed to the two far ends of the political spectrum. And it's always interesting. It's remarkable to me how often sometimes we'll actually get a Republican and a Democrat analyst to agree on something, which I think is helpful. And I think we need more of that, because there is far too little of it, both in the state and nationally.
You know, when we do political panels on Almanac, it depends a little bit whether it's a 4-person panel or a 2-person. You know, the pandemic's not been kind to 4-person panels. You know, you're looking for people who are, you know, good on camera. It's not a given. You're looking for people, from our experience, the best political panelists are pragmatic. They aren't pure party necessarily, because then it's boring and predictable. The other piece that's really important is diversity, capital D, little d. You want age diversity, you want regional diversity, gender. But, you know, in Minnesota, the piece of diversity that matters the most and is the most lacking is racial diversity. In our world, both in our panels and on air, you know, we set a goal for years now to be reflective of community. About 25% of the adults in the Twin Cities, 7-county metro area are people of color, and that's our target for on-air representation. Almanac in the last year had 35% BIPOC on-air guests. We track that weekly. We talk about it, and it's front and center important. So, you know, I think with political panels, you want a combination of people who are familiar to your audience so that they feel comfortable, and you want people who are new and fresh to your audience that challenge them a little bit. And that balance is kind of, in a nutshell, the work that we have to do.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. For us in election coverage, it's a lot of, okay, who have we talked to over the last year? Who was concise and who knows what's going on? Who knows how the sausage is made? Who can be sitting on the panel during a commercial break and fire off a text and get some additional information or context? You know, and like you said, you want somebody who's got the credentials, who's, you know, not only looks diverse, but has a little bit of a diverse background. So people get that fresh perspective, you know, and also we grab coffee with a lot of people. We want to make sure, like Tom touched on, that we're not going to have somebody who's way far one way, because it's just going to be, nope, you're not even listening. There's no debate, there's no discussion. And that's the fun part of politics, especially, is the discussion and the debate within it. And so you want that gray zone, and it's a fine balance. And some years you can hit it and some days you miss.
Yeah, because, you know, I don't mind when we get Democrats and Republicans to agree. Some people think, well, that's boring television. They're not at each other's throats. And, you know, Crossfire was the show on CNN years ago that kind of created that dynamic that we're not going to watch unless we have two people going at it like, you know, rabid cats and dogs. I look at it differently, but my job is to help inform viewers, not inflame them. And so if I can find two people who can have a rational discussion, maybe respectfully disagree with each other, and maybe occasionally agree with each other, I think that's a home run.
Yeah. Years ago, when Jon Stewart was on Crossfire, I thought was an excellent segment of really calling them out on that divisiveness and really what they were trying to do on that show, and the opportunity that they had really with that show, what they were doing. I want to remind everybody for in the audience, just real quickly, remember to throw your questions in the chat. We are reading through those, and I'm going to go to some of those questions now, and we bring through some of those. So a reminder, if you're in, welcome to the Zoom meeting, by the way, and the Emerging Ideas series, but throw your questions in the chat and we'll ask those as we go. One of the questions that was here, and I thought from an earlier conversation that we had, was a little bit of how technology has changed a little bit for us, and we're seeing a lot more quick feedback, if you will. And Tom, you'd made a point of they may not be tuned in next week to see the counterpoint and the other argument of that. How do you feel? How do each of the three of you really think about how fast things move? Now, this makes me sound like I'm my grandpa, and I'm 98 years old these days. Back in the day, when we had a newspaper, it was a one-way conversation, and even in television and radio, those were one-way conversations. Now that we have technology and social media and 24-hour news cycles, how do you think the expectations have changed from the viewers from the beginning of your career to now, and how are you addressing that? How are you really approaching that as you program?
I'd like to, social media, it's hard for us to believe. I think I've been on Twitter since 2009 or 10 or 11, I forget, and Facebook about the same amount of time. It's amazing how those have evolved in such a short time. They used to be a fairly friendly and informative space. And in particular, Twitter, in many ways, has become a cesspool of anonymous flamethrowers, people who don't use their real name, don't use their real picture, and they throw out misinformation like nobody's business, including about things you may have just reported on, and then they misreport on what you just reported on. And it is incredibly frustrating. And I used to engage with some of them more than I do now. I will still engage with people who, when I know who they are, if they use their real name and they've got a respectful question or point of view. But when you've got, some guy named Persnickety Santa Claus loves Trump, and a fake picture, and then he just starts ripping you left and right, I just ignore him. And I have I didn't used to block anybody. I mean, I didn't block anybody on Twitter. Free marketplace of ideas. Unless now I've altered my stance on that. If you're anonymous and you spread misinformation, you're not going to do it on my Twitter page. I'm going to block you. The moment you start using profanity or spreading misinformation and you're anonymous, I'm going to block you. I don't have time for it. And I don't think people should be exposed to that. So we get this instant feedback, but so often it's just total nonsense. Now, in many cases, you get good constructive feedback, but sadly, that's about 10 to 20% of the time.
Tracy or Brendan, as you're putting together panels and your questions, and you're helping develop the story, and you're developing the segment or the show, if it's an entirety, have these viewer expectations changed on how you approach that?
I think so for us. A lot of times I'm not on air, right? So I'm not on set monitoring my Twitter. And there are some people who are very good at it. But if I'm in the booth, if I'm in the control room where, you mentioned the newsroom where everyone's yelling into earpieces and shouting, when Tom goes like this and starts talking, that's me yelling in his ear. Well, not from CCO.
Oh, you have Tom's earpiece from the other station. That's great. Wow. Yeah.
It's a new thing we're
always yelling at me.
Yeah. But that's me. And so there are times where I will be monitoring during a show, whether it's political show or a sports show. I mean, my gosh, sports shows get the most kind of instant feedback when we're doing those with their hot takes. But we will drop in and say, hey, so-and-so mentioned this, or during a break, we'll bring something up, and that'll spark a conversation that happens on air. Doesn't happen as often during a newscast, just because that's a lot more structured. But it definitely can lead to some really good conversations when it's the appropriate people and the appropriate questions.
Yeah, like Tom had said, that they're vetted and you know who they are.
Yeah. We get sent a lot of so-and-so reported this. Axios said that. Did you see this article from CNN? How come Tom Hauser saying this and Pat Kessler said that? And you're like, well, we're different reporters. We work at different stations and we have different angles to our stories sometimes. And other times you're like, well, that was a really good point. We should look into that. So we're also monitoring to see what else people are saying and doing, and that can gauge the conversation.
There are obviously really helpful times, when social media tells you things. Someone, did you really say this? Did you mean that? You're having some technical issues. I'm out here in Waseca. We're statewide and we're on a bunch of different stations. So, those trouble reports, come in handy. Almanac has had a voicemail, started out life answering machine feedback, and over the years, more than 100,000 people have weighed in. And it's funny, Tom, because you're anonymous and nasty on a voicemail too, just like you are on social media. And so, we had 30 years of, practice with that. And, you quickly learn to, if 8 people say something and they're saying the same thing, if 20 people do, they may be onto something. But boy, you got to be pretty thick-skinned in this business, or else, you're going to just kind of have trouble sleeping every night.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Brendan. I don't even mind when the criticism is like personally aimed at me for whatever reason, but I really get frustrated when people spread misinformation. I'm more concerned when they're critical of valid information that we passed along that they just simply disagree with, and that's what frustrates me more. I mean, after nearly 40 years in this business, people can and have taken all the shots they want, and that's fine. But it just, when they start criticizing credible, legitimately gathered information, that's what is the most frustrating to me.
Absolutely. Bringing this a little bit more current, I guess with a current topic, when items that shouldn't be political become political, and I'm bringing up COVID, right? Which is you're reporting on what should be a science or a health-based program, but it has quite obviously become political throughout the entire process, very early on, and become politicized. And now with things like the Vikings, and now you've got sports, which brings in a whole new segment of viewers or participants that really pay attention to sports, but maybe don't pay attention to the other side of things. How do you approach the that kind of crossover? Maybe now we've got a different audience, maybe a different listener or a different viewer coming into things. Do you take that into account as you're trying to format the report or put together people to report on that for you, or how you program for that? How does that work when you have something that should be non-political that has become politicized? Then how do you approach that reporting?
Especially with COVID, you can't factualize something that isn't true. So if we know that there is a talking head out there saying, this is going to cure COVID, or I've done this sort of research and this is what I say, but that the hard evidence is there that that's not true. We've quoted those people before and straight out said, there is no scientific evidence to confirm that or to validate that, and address it, but not, we're not going to seek out, I don't even know who, to validate that. And so if you take the Kirk Cousins issue, and him saying, I'm going to do everything I can, you then say, but you're not taking the one thing that doctors have said will work, right? And it then almost becomes not a scientific political issue, but you can turn it into an economic discussion. Well, what happens when your team's now sitting out? You've got fans who have given money to the game
So
to
you're
go see the
looking at
game
an
that aren't
angle.
there.
Okay.
The employees at the stadium. So, the conversation can kind of change because it's not worth getting in the middle of a debate doesn't need to be a debate. One report on TV isn't going to change Kirk's mind or anybody else's. And especially when you've got other people on the team like Coach Zimmer saying, I don't know why these guys aren't doing it. We'd be out of this mess if they did it. So you ask them about it, and like I said, you can't validate things that aren't, validated, and you explain it.
So you bring up this follow-up question to that, if you will, Tracy. Mm-hmm. At what point as you guys put together your programming, do you look at an item and say, this is newsworthy, this is news, and I want to report on this, and I want to communicate this, and I want to present these facts, but the value of that, to the point of the controversy between Zimmer and his star quarterback, right? There's something to report on of controversy. I think, Tom, you had mentioned Crossfire, right? Brings up good ratings because it's good television, because we can bring up an argument within that. At what point in your guys' in your minds, as you're putting together these programs, you say worth it, not worth it, reportable? No, it's not going to drive the conversation. It's not going to drive that. How are those decisions made? How do you approach that decision making? Right, wrong, and indifferent. How do you approach that decision making?
Brendan, you want to take that? Or
Yeah. I think frankly, it's a different equation. We're never a threat to win our time slot. And that's a different pressure than you feel in a commercial space. And so, we can afford to ignore some things that other folks got to pay attention to, just because we're less interested in that. And, we can elevate other stories that other folks probably wouldn't take a risk on. So it's a different equation in our space. When it comes to COVID, you look at the Vikings and it's like you have a couple reactions. One is like, how did Coach Zimmer become the voice of reason in the vaccine world? That's a fascinating angle in and of itself. But the other thing you do is the common denominator in all this is, that's a workplace. Those Viking players are like your co-workers. It's just a really rarefied air they're in. And, and what's America doing to try to get people to take the vaccine? Are you going to require it to come into your workplace? Are you having mandatory testing? Essentially you're saying, if you don't do it, you can't work for us. That's the common denominator. And that's, it's a challenging, interesting story that I think everyone can relate to at some level or not in that workplace setting.
And, the interesting thing is we've gone from masks used to be the big debate point, and now it has turned to vaccines. Now, masking is still a big debate point. And I think people have more legitimate questions about the efficacy of masks than of the vaccine, mostly just based on what the experts initially told us. You all remember last March and April, or I guess it's a year ago, March and April, everybody from Dr. Fauci to Dr. Osterholm were saying, there's just not evidence that cloth masks are going to make a big difference. And save the good masks for medical professionals. Yeah, the N95. You and I shouldn't go around wearing them. So it's been messy signaling for a long time. Yeah, so they started that, and then all of a sudden, within like a week or two, there is some evidence. There was a coordinated effort in the CDC and elsewhere. Okay, let's get people to wear masks. We don't know exactly how well they're going to work, especially the cloth masks, but let's make that our message. And frankly, there has not been a great study done since all of this started, because it's frankly unethical to do a peer-reviewed scientific study of masks, because you need control groups where people are not wearing masks. And in the middle of a pandemic, it's considered unethical to put people potentially in harm's way if masks really do work, to have a control group not wear masks. So there is a lot of debate about that, but the issue of vaccines, it has been studied for so long. A lot of people think this vaccine just popped up in the last 8 to 12 months, which is not true. The original, I forget which strain of SARS it was, 10 or 20 years ago is when this vaccine development started. So there's a much longer track record here, but there's so many little nuances like that. It's hard to get that across, especially the three of us are in television. It's hard to get that nuance across in the couple minutes we might have on segments like this to talk about these issues. And so you leave people with, in some cases, sadly, more questions than answers.
Yeah, I think, conversations continue and information evolves, and you want those little checkpoints where you're constantly going in and fact checking. And whether it's COVID or a health issue or an economic issue and taxes, lawmakers can change their mind on how they feel on certain issues. And sometimes it is us who has to go back and be like, oh, wait, you said this last time. Now you're thinking this, or party platforms change. And, just because something's done one day doesn't mean that that's a closed door issue. And now it's, they're done and things are set in stone. And and having those kind of continued conversations as communities evolve and conversations change and the climate changes. I think it's important to continue to go back and have multiple conversations, and that doesn't always happen, or people aren't always seeking that out and looking for those continued conversations for more information, for new information and new ideas.
Yeah, that's part of the struggle, certainly. So we just have a few minutes left, and I want to continue taking some questions here from the audience. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of those questions. On a national level, it gets reported when sponsors leave national news programs. It's a big deal. It helps fund a certain conversation that goes a certain way on with programs. At a local level, that's certainly less reported. But there's some questions in the chat that I wanted to have the three of you address. How do you communicate, and what would you say to how do you respond to the argument or the statement, if you will, that sponsors drive programming? I think from a journalistic aspect, I think I can answer for all three of you that it doesn't drive the programming. But how do you respond to that? What is it that you say? I mean, it's come up a couple times in the chat, but really that's ingrained in some of the consumers' head that sponsors can drive the programming. I know from a journalistic standpoint it doesn't, but how do you respond to that?
Well, I have no idea on any given night what ads are running in our newscasts, and I don't care. It's helpful if there are ads because it pays for the lights around me right now, pays my salary, and those types of things. But it doesn't matter to me who's advertising. I'm grateful that there are advertisers who support commercial broadcasting. There's other sponsors who support public broadcasting like TPT. And so, but on any given night, I don't know who's paying the freight. And again, I never ask, and it doesn't influence me one way or another.
Yeah, same. We don't pay for interviews.
Okay.
We don't pay for transportation to interviews. We don't pay for places to do interviews. And so it's never been an issue, I guess, for us. Now in a management role, there are times where we've done certain investigations where we've given the heads up to our sales guys just so they don't, I'm staring at a caribou. So we don't do this expose on caribou and then run a commercial for caribou in the same block, but it's never once shifted or changed, or I've never been told to include a question or information.
Yeah, and I've never been told not to do a story because, let's say on the auto industry, because auto dealers are among the biggest advertisers on television, but that's never made us shy away from covering stories that might be negative about the auto industry if there's a legitimate story there.
Yeah, same.
And Brendan, you're in a little bit of a different aspect with TPT, but I guess I'd like to turn the question a little bit. Has there ever been a time where you would think that you've gone to either your sales groups or your folks and said, hey, if we were to pursue this sponsor, this may hurt our credibility? Has there ever been a reverse situation where, like, hey, can you please steer away from a certain either particular sponsor or particular individual or anything, where you said, can you please make sure that that's not on my airtime?
I think the key, frankly, is just not to have those conversations. And
Okay.
you don't have those conversations. I don't have those conversations with our sales team. Public broadcasting is funny. I'm old enough to remember when, in the 1970s and 80s, people joked that PBS stood for Petroleum Broadcasting Service, because Mobil and Exxon, they wanted to cleanse their public image. Mm-hmm. Masterpiece Theater literally was once called the Mobil Masterpiece Theater because, they wanted to cleanse public images by doing things. At the end of the day, you do the work that you think is important. There's a firewall that exists in all of our organizations. Right. And it's there for a good reason. And you don't end up having those concerns if you're doing your job right.
And that has evolved quite a bit over the several decades now that TV has been on the air. But in the early days of broadcasting, and you can look it up on YouTube, you will see news anchors sitting there with a gallon of milk on the anchor desk, and they'll
We're smoking.
read a few stories, and then they'll say, by the way, don't forget your friends at Northland Dairy or whatever. And then they might even take a drink of the milk. And those days are long gone. We do not do that anymore. But in the early days of broadcasting, that actually happened.
Short of NASCAR sponsorships, right? Everybody's got a patch on,
We
right?
don't look like NASCAR.
I would hitch a pretty big fit if somebody tried to say, hey, your political show is not sponsored by whomever. There's different times where that happens. Back, pre-pandemic, our state fair show, for instance, would be sponsored by some random company in town who has some initiative that ties into the state fair experience. They're not really driving our content. It's just hey, they're paying for ad time, and we say that. But I think there would be a lot of very upset news people in a lot of newsrooms if we found out, you got to start covering weather in Duluth because the Duluth PACCO is going to be sponsoring your forecasts or whatever.
Well, we have time for one final question, and I kind of want to wrap it up here with this one with each of you. So I want you to think about this that you've done a fantastic job of thinking about every question, by the way. So I don't want to insinuate that you weren't. But what is one thing about political television at a local level that you feel isn't widely understood by audiences that you wish that they could really understand? So what's the big thing that you really wish folks would take away from your programming? I see two people with their eyes up and left, which insinuates right side thinking. Yeah. That's good.
From my standpoint, I'll just reiterate what I said before. I do not have an agenda. Our newsroom does not have an agenda. We've got a table at our 9:45 meeting this morning where there's 20 people sitting around a table. These are producers on the television side, the web producers, assignment managers, the news director, the political reporter. We're all there. We all come from different backgrounds, all from different persuasions, and we're debating and talking about what to cover. And there is no agenda. There's no, okay, how can we go out and get after Governor Walz today? Or how can we go out and support Governor Walz today? That never happens. It has never happened in my nearly 29 years here at Channel 5, or frankly, at any of the 4 TV stations I've worked at. And it's amazing to me how many people still don't understand that. They think we're all agenda driven by our own personal bias. Even if I tried to be, I couldn't get away with it because there's 19 other people in that room who are going to see that, and they have their own opinions, and it just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I would say also there's never enough time. There's no way we can touch on every single argument of every single point and present to you every bit of information and show our homework every single time. So, there is a level of trust that needs to be there with the viewers that has really dissipated over the last, 5-6 years, I think. Generally speaking, you could go on TV with a report and information and give your quick source and cite it where that came from. And now people are like, they need to hear it. They need to see it. They want to smell it, taste it, touch it. They have to have the complete experience, and you really have to walk people through things more than we used to be able to just say, this is what it is, and then progress the conversation. So there's just never enough time. We don't have, the luxury, unless it's our website, to really run through a full information of things and to say, nope, here's our work. And then again, like Tom said, there's so many people involved in each story that you never see, that you have, I'm never going to go on TV. You're never going to see me there, but I'm definitely involved in every single aspect of stories that end up on my shows.
Thanks.
From my particular perspective, just to give a different answer, not that those weren't great answers, but it's what I often think is that often the strength of the show we do on Friday nights, it's live and in studio, and there's danger in doing live. And you also have to convince someone to, drive down to a studio in downtown St. Paul on a Friday night. Many people apparently think like Friday night is like a weekend, the start of the weekend, apparently. People think that. That's what I hear. So, so part of me is always saying, boy, you really would have liked the show I wanted to do this week, but this is the show I had to do this week. And so, but that's the wonder and joy of a weekly live too, is that, if it's a great show, you feel good about it. And if it's not your best effort, thank God you got a chance to prove yourself again soon. So, I've gone in periods of my life where I've worked on 6-month documentaries, and they're great fun, but my goodness, you need more kind of action and the ability to kind of like, when you screw up, to have another chance, and the humbleness of feeling good about something, but knowing that, you're just, minutes, hours, days away from another potential disaster. So that's the joy of live, is that it rewards and punishes in equal amounts.
Well, it's 12:57. Being respectful of everybody's time, unfortunately it's come to an end here. But man, Tracy, Brendan, Tom, thank you so much for your time and all, and seriously, all the work that you and your teams do. I mean, I think that last answer really kind of helped bring it together. It's not just the three of you. It's gigantic teams behind you that help bring this thing to the public. It's not easy, but it's needed. And we appreciate, and we all appreciate the service that you guys provide to the public, and making sure that we're informed as we go into the voting booth each November. So I appreciate that. With that, Shannon, our Executive Director of Majority in the Middle, it is back to you.
Thanks, Steve. I'd also like to thank our panelists and for Steve for moderating the discussion. I was getting quite a few text messages during the presentation that this is an outstanding discussion, and can we do this every week? And we cannot do this every week, which would be delightful. I mean, anytime the three of you want to come back, anytime, I will set that up. But I am going to put in the chat the link to our events page. Like we said at the top of the hour, this is our first Emerging Ideas event. We have several more, and I'll give you guys a preview. One that was just confirmed this morning. So in late September, you're not going to see this on the list yet, but in late September, we're going to have Senator Susan Kent and Senator Jeremy Miller. Earlier in their legislative careers, they were part of the Purple Caucus in the Senate, which was senators from both sides who got together to put together policy things and try to work things out. Many of those senators have moved up into leadership or who have left the Senate, and so that group doesn't actually exist anymore. But we're going to talk to them about how that experience early in their legislative career informed their jobs in leadership now. Susan as the minority leader of the Senate, and Jeremy as the president. So that one's going to be super cool. I'm very excited about that. So check out the other events. I am also going to make the pitch for financial support to Majority in the Middle. Like I mentioned at the top of the program, we are a young organization. And turns out starting up a nonprofit is a very expensive endeavor. So every dollar does help us do things like file government registrations and trademarks and pay the Zoom bills so we can host events. So if you are in a position to donate, please do, and thank you. Like we said, I'm going to unspotlight our panelists. I think they have to go. We definitely appreciate the time and thank you again.